I will just let, oh, you are saying, okay.
But
She
you
was-
was gonna do an intro.
Yeah.
You're not gonna start.
So wrapping up the first year of monitoring for our CFLRP, when we initially made the decision on how we were going to prioritize what to monitor for wildlife, we reached out to a number of partners. Laura with Fish and Wildlife Service was there, and Pam Hardy, and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Confederated Tribe Umatilla, and others weighed in on what were some of the most pressing issues that we could monitor the effects of our treatments on. And one of the priorities we came up with was avian monitoring. And that decision of what to monitor was really challenging because monitoring is so complex and we have to be very specific with asking targeted questions. And so, for example, if you look at other monitoring plans from other CFLRPs, what you'll often see is they're monitoring only a single species of wildlife, and perhaps due to lack of capacity or limited funding or both. And so the problem with that is that monitoring a single species only gives us limited information on the effects of our management on ecosystem function. And so that's why we're so excited about the study design that KDO is Climate Bird Observatory is employing to examine the effects of our management on the avian community. And as you'll hear more from Jaime, birds are excellent indicators of ecosystem function. And the way they respond to our treatments gives us insight into whether we're maintaining the appropriate mix of habitat attributes on the landscape. And Climate Bird Observatory is a longstanding partner of the Forest Service, and they're known for producing high quality science that has helped inform forest management for many years now. And so we're really excited to partner with them on our CFLRP. So we know that we'll be getting some solid information on the effects of our management that will be accompanied by decision support tools that will help inform our NEPA and strengthen our effects analyses and help us be better stewards of our wildlife resources. So thank you, Jaime.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
That'd be awesome. Thanks. Thanks so much for inviting me today. I'm really excited to be getting involved with your collaborative. I'm going to be talking today about aligning bird conservation priorities with the restoration planning, monitoring, and adaptive management. Huge thanks to Jaime Ratliff for our ongoing partnership, and Tom McLaren is here today with me from Climate Bird Observatory. He joined our team about 3 weeks ago, and he's going to be overseeing our field work here next spring. So he's getting to know the area. And then just a quick recognition of a handful of other KBO folks: Meredith, Kate, Caitlin, and John, who were instrumental in the work I'm presenting today. For those of you who are likely unfamiliar with my organization, Climate Bird Observatory studies birds and their habitats to ensure the sustainability of healthy populations and to reverse the declines of those that are in trouble. We share that information with people that are implementing management or restoration on the ground, as well as with the community and the next generation. Our science is rooted in long-term monitoring to keep a pulse on how bird populations are doing generally, as well as applied ecology, where we study how birds are responding to different natural or anthropogenic changes on the landscape, like we're doing here with this partnership, as well as a component of theoretical research to better understand bird distributions and limiting factors across their full annual cycle. It's our model that incorporating those 3 areas of research is what allows us to effectively apply bird conservation to conservation planning. We were originally rooted in the Klamath bioregion of Southern Oregon and Northern California, but over the last 6 to 8 years, our field work has expanded across the state of Oregon, a little bit into Washington as well, and still really active in Northern California. So we apply the results of our own field research along with those of our partners through an avian data center called Avian Knowledge Northwest. I'll touch just a little bit on that in a second. And then we work internationally across the ranges of our shared birds, primarily through partnerships and shared learning and capacity building. So Avian Knowledge Northwest is a regional avian data center that is maintained by Klamath Bird Observatory, and it is a node to the International Avian Knowledge Network. For those of you unfamiliar with this, it is an amazing archive with the goal to ensure the perpetuity of historic data and to get historic data into a single system so that it doesn't essentially get abandoned in people's desk drawers or floppy disks. And oh my God, we so need that. Thank you. We have that. Klamath Bird Observatory is actually the main entity that does a lot of bulk uploading of historic data. So if you know data sets that need to get into this system, we have tools and structures in place and people in place to help get those data into this system. And then we do a lot of work to make sure that data that's currently being collected goes directly into the system. All of the huge support from our federal agencies, all of the bird observatories, and lots of people. This has been around about a decade and has a ton of buy-in. The reason that we started a regional node was more about, in addition to getting the data in, it was about the data out. How can we make sure that all of the avian resources are easily available at people's fingertips? So it's a platform for all of our conservation planning, as well as a lot of interactive decision support tools and data exploration. Lots of fun. I encourage you to check it out if it's of interest to you. Most importantly, I wanted you to know that the data that we're collecting here on the Northern Blues is going into the system, which will allow it to step up to range-wide analyses. So why birds? A paper came out in the publication Science just several years ago, documenting that we've lost 3 billion birds since 1970. We've lost 30% of our bird biomass just over that time period. And that includes a lot of common species that you're used to seeing in your backyards. The crisis in bird conservation is no longer about our threatened and endangered species. It's really about a large proportion of our species. This holds true for our Western forest birds. 50% of our forest dependent birds in the West are in decline. 30% of those are in decline, but it's concerning. So there's all these different metrics of decline. So because of that, we're really at a unique moment. Landscape level conservation actions are needed now more than ever, and they are also. So how can we ensure that the work that's happening is not only good for our ecosystems, but also for our bird populations? So bird conservation is largely arranged into bird conservation regions. These look very similar to other ecoregions that you're accustomed to working in, but this is just kind of the platform where avian data is arranged around. And so the Northern Blues falls into Bird Conservation Region 10, Northern Rockies. And so a lot of the maps I'm going to be showing today are going to be specific to Bird Conservation Region 10. And then in some cases, we did some data synthesis at a Hawkeye watershed level. In the last year, we had the opportunity to kind of launch a Western Forest initiative. This was supported by the Pacific Birds Joint Venture and Intermountain West Joint Venture. And it's going to be
done to the front desk. Rachel's done to the front desk. Thank you.
We don't have that in my office. I'm sorry. Loudspeaker. So the Western Forest Initiative allowed us just to kind of take a step back and do a data synthesis to think about how we can use all the available avian science with these types of landscape scale restoration planning. So we identified priority birds by bird conservation region, evaluated the urgency of those at-risk species, and created a spatial layer of stacked species richness. And then we presented that within the context of forest types, forest departure, avian climate risk, as well as benefits to water. So I'm going to show you how this is applicable to the Northern Blues. It's not different than what KBO was originally doing here, but it provides kind of a nice storyboard to talk about how we're working with you guys. So in Bird Conservation Region 10, there were more than 40 species that were documented at risk. This is all rooted in a very standard database. This isn't our own science. Very importantly, we're just synthesizing what is already the acceptable best science. So now that we have those 40 at-risk species identified, we can design a Western Forest Initiative that makes a meaningful impact to a suite of these species. So I'm going to step through this idea using this roadmap concept. So when we talk about bird conservation, we're really talking about using birds as indicators for ecosystem function. We're going to talk about both focal species as well as at-risk species and how both of these can be used for prioritization of where we're going to work, or to talk about desired conditions, fine-tuning our prescriptions on the ground, and essentially in combination with the goal of increasing quality of our work as we increase the pace and scale of this restoration. And birds are really well studied and they're really well received. And we've had really good success using this concept to provide essentially bringing science to the table, to bring diverse audiences together and gain some social license around some of the types of treatments that we're doing that may be a little less well understood. Okay, so starting our roadmap, we're going to start with birds as indicators. So Partners in Flight is a voluntary partnership that was developed in the 1990s. With the goal to keep common birds common and reverse the declines of those that are in trouble. And in Oregon and Washington, the Partners in Flight chapters developed bird conservation plans. These bird conservation plans applied the focal species approach. Essentially, in the Northern Rocky Mountains, we have 24 focal species. Each of these focal species is a relatively common species associated with a certain forest type, and then within that forest type associated with a specific habitat metric, something like a large tree, stags, down wood, those types of metrics. The premise is that by managing for a suite of focal species that are representative of these important habitat components, we can manage for ecosystem function. Really important, the Forest Service has been involved in Partners in Flight since its conception and has collaborated on these Partners in Flight conservation plans, specifically applicable to your region. And this one was updated, all of them were updated in the last 5 years, so they really are still the best available science. So one of the things that's nice about studying the suite of species, and Jaime kind of led into this, is that because birds respond to these very specific habitat attributes, when we study the entire suite of forest birds, each individual species can kind of provide its own measuring stick of what's changing in the ecosystem. We have our generalist species that are likely to be abundant regardless of changes. And then we have birds that are associated with habitat metrics, and also birds that are we consider obligates, like they simply won't be there if you remove this component of the ecosystem. So in this way, we can use our focal species as another measure of ecological effects of our restoration treatment. So this is a table of the focal species for your region, and you can see on the left-hand column, you have your habitat type, in the middle column, your specific habitat attribute. Relevant to some of the conversations we were just having, large patches of late successional forest with heterogeneous canopy cover. Some of them are really that complex forest structure, some of them as simple as large snags. And then you have your focal species here in the right-hand column. So after we think about using our focal species as kind of that ecological lens, we of course right now want to be considering climate in everything we do. And I always like to say that we can use climate science as it relates to birds as just another piece of the climate science. I just started to get familiar with the work you guys are doing, and you guys are using already cutting edge climate science. And so this is just a potential another lens that looks at climate. And the work that I've been looking at and applying the Western Forest Initiative came out of National Audubon. This is a publication, Bateman et al. 2020, and there's some current data layers that aren't yet published that are really, I think, the latest and greatest in thinking about how climate relates to risk for birds. So going from individual species vulnerability to spatial climate risk. And if you guys are interested in this, we should invite this person to come talk. I did work with her to synthesize her data set in the context of some spatial layers, so we could think about them. And this is how it relates to bird conservation region 10, where those areas in red are representing the highest risk for birds based upon climate.
Really, go into that a little bit more, like what's going on in those few areas, like why is it not all red and why is it not all yellow? Or do we have, is this what you want us to invite the actual author for?
Really, I do. It's
Okay.
it's very complex. And I can speak to it a little bit, but I think for the sake of time, I might come back to it if we have time, if that's okay.
That's fine,
Because it involves all of that.
okay. Fair enough.
Leave you in suspense, Pam.
And then, of course, we want to be thinking about ecological departure. And again, thinking about ecological departure as it relates to our at-risk birds. So you guys are familiar with this concept. I've seen it in a lot of your writing. How much of the landscape has changed from its historic natural range of variation and the distribution of those ecosystem characteristics related to a historic point in time. So we talk about this not in the context of returning to that historic condition, but rather, can we use ecological departure to understand why some of our at-risk birds are at risk? What of our at-risk birds are doing better because of that ecological departure and which are doing worse, and how that relates to our restoration treatments. And then we have another map. They're all going to be equally complex, where we look at vegetation departure condition class. This is from DeMayo et al. And the red areas are the highest departed. And really, bird conservation region 10 is relatively intact compared to a lot of the maps like this for the areas to the west. But shows some of the hotspots for departure within your region. I think you guys are using some different departure metrics, and so there's probably something that's best available science for this region. We used DeMayo et al. For this project because it's through land fire and was available across the entire Western US. I know in some of my other partnerships we use other layers as well. And then we can start thinking about those at-risk species that I've been alluding to but haven't shown you yet. And so this is where we just did a really simple stacked species richness of those 40 at-risk species for bird conservation region 10, where you're seeing the highest species richness of at-risk species in the darkest green areas. This is the list of those at-risk species for the Northern Rockies Bird Conservation Region. It's organized into 4 categories, again, from the Avian Conservation Assessment Database that I alluded to being the best available science. We don't have any critical recovery species in this region, 2 species for immediate action, and then large suites of species that are calling for management attention and planning and responsibility. And that relates to essentially the rate of decline, how much of that decline has happened in the recent past, like the last 10 years, and then what those risk factors are for those birds, all combined into some regional scores. So we had the opportunity to start our monitoring this spring. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about how we're monitoring birds at the end of my talk. But we did our first round of surveys in spring of 2022. And the work that we did this year was limited to cool, moist forest. And so with this relatively early and small data set, we were able to look at bird relative abundance within that cool, moist forest type and allow us to filter that list to think about how it might apply to management decision making. And so from that data set, we have 8 species that are relatively common pre-restoration. What I mean by relatively common is that they were detected on 1 out of every 5 points. And across all of our work, that is kind of a gestalt relatively common bird on the landscape. And then the species in blue, just slightly less common, detected almost on like every 6 or 7 points. And then the species in green were also regularly detected in the region. The thought process being here that we can now consider these species at risk as we're thinking about how our restoration treatments might impact them. In the context of if we can first kind of do no harm to the species that are relatively abundant, or if there are going to be trade-offs, think about those trade-offs. And so I'll talk more about that in a second. But the species in gray are relatively uncommon in the project area. And so I think they're likely associated with really specific habitat attributes that aren't largely available. I wouldn't encourage us to be really thinking about creating habitat for those species in gray unless there's some more specific knowledge on the ground.
Did you pick up all of the species in gray?
Yeah.
So where'd you get mountain quail?
I didn't do this field work, but I could get you that information for sure. And these data are available for you through Data Knowledge Northwest. I can actually get you guys a user code and you can see your own data.
Wow. So cool.
So we want to think about this process in the context of NEPA and environmental assessments. I had the opportunity only to review a couple of the documents that you guys are working on, but generally when we see NEPA documents or environmental assessments that are restoration based, they involve all the same ecological restoration that we talk about for bird conservation. So this is just an example of how we're trying to increase forest resilience, protect and promote the old trees and old growth structure, increasing heterogeneity and ecosystem function. These are the sideboards that, so much good work can fit within. Where we really find this information to be more practical is in contributing to and informing the prescriptions. So how can we increase the quality and complexity while we're increasing the pace and scale of this work? So I was really impressed with your zones of agreements when I first reviewed them. And this one about wildlife habitat trade-offs is just spot on to the story I'm telling here. So not every acre can do everything. Whenever we take an action on the ground, some birds are going to benefit while others are going to be hindered. And I think I'm just going to give everyone a second to refresh on this zone of agreement because it's really relevant to the story that I'm telling. So I'm just going to let you read it though, because I don't want to. So this context aligns really well as we think about trade-offs for our ecosystems with the focal species approach and also for these at-risk species. How can we think specifically at the site scale while also thinking about the landscape scale? So this is some early work we did from that data set we collected last spring. Thinking about how our at-risk species may be affected by restoration treatments. So on the left, we have our at-risk species again, the ones in red already relatively common, blue pretty common, and the green also prevalent on the landscape. And then across the top, we have our habitat attributes. They're primarily pulled directly from that Partners in Fight conservation plan that I was talking about. And then we color coded them. Tom put together a table that has a whole bunch of words in it, essentially talking about the bird habitat association with that habitat attribute. And then we kind of made a gestalt call as to whether or not we thought that species, or from our understanding of the literature, that species benefits from that habitat attribute. So here we have golden crown kinglet on the top line. Our golden crown kinglets like a forest with high canopy cover, high sub-canopy cover, as well as patches of dense understory shrubs. Golden crown kinglets are not in favor of forest edges or openings, and they're just really neutral. They don't require large snags on the landscape. So they've got, 3 greens, a yellow, and a red. And so it's just kind of nice, I think, at a glance, you can see how our relatively common species in red really are species that are enjoying that high canopy cover and sub-canopy overall. That makes sense. That's where we have our forests that are outside our historical range of variability. And then we have at the bottom here, focal species to benefit. This is intended to be a direct crosswalk between this new Western Forest Initiative bird conservation region at-risk species approach and the partners in flight focal species approach. Yeah.
This might be a silly question, but are you talking high canopy cover like feet high or thickness?
Thickness.
Okay, thank you.
Really important clarification. Thank you. So based upon that information, we can either use it to, fine tune those prescriptions, inform restoration planning, and then also to predict the response of those birds. So one thing we want to be doing when we do ecological monitoring is not just measuring change. We want to measure whether or not the change is going in the direction we want or going in the direction we expect. So preferably both, but I guess those would be the same. We should want the change that we're going after. And so we can make those predictions now for this suite of species for this region. And this is just kind of an example of how we would do that. And so whenever there's changes on the ground, every species is going to be impacted. Sometimes that affects species composition, essentially what species are present in that stand. So in this example, we have a younger overstock stand, and we've got evening grosbeaks, Hansen's warblers, and western tanagers. As we restore that stand and start to develop that older heterogeneous structure, we're going to see species coming in like the mountain chickadee and affiliated with woodpecker. We have some interim flycatchers in between as the forest kind of moves along that trajectory. But we're also going to see changes in abundance, and we can measure that as well. And so we might have more western tanagers in the younger overstock stand, but they're likely still to be present at some level of abundance in older stands as well. Red-breasted nuthatch having that opposite relationship, less abundant an older structure, heterogeneous. And so typically when we do bird monitoring, we look at both of these things. So really though, to measure individual species abundance change, you need something that's either incredibly dramatic, like going from a forest to a clear cut, or you need a very, very high sample size. And so often with the level of acres that we're able to monitor, it's easier to measure shifts in community composition, which looks at both numbers as well as how those numbers change across the community. So what I want to do next, and we're going to spend some time talking about this in the field tomorrow, is think specifically about the restoration prescriptions. We're going to have the opportunity to go out to some of the stands that we monitored pre-restoration that have been treated already this summer and take a look at the prescriptions that were applied and think about our predicted response for our at-risk species. I just got a hold of those prescriptions a few days ago, and so didn't have a chance to fill that out. But what we're kind of expecting we'll see is that those species that So what our general restoration premise here is gonna be opening up the forest, reducing that canopy cover, creating more heterogeneity. So we're likely gonna see predicted response that's going to either maintain or reduce the really common at-risk species, but hopefully then see some trade-offs where our species here that are liking the forest edges and openings would then that are relatively less abundant now would show increases in abundance. And so this aligns just really specifically with that goal and that sort of agreement. How do we measure and be thoughtful about what those trade-offs are? Any questions about that before I shift to monitoring?
I'm just so glad you're doing this. This is a really well thought out system.
Thank you. So yeah, the idea being that we can just go out and monitor birds, but if we do all this other stuff ahead of time, that monitoring is going to be more meaningful, a lot more meaningful, and it's going to be a lot more relevant to adaptive management. And so first we're going to go out and do pre-restoration monitoring. And so our monitoring is happening at 2 scales. I'll touch more on that in a second. So we're doing monitoring at the stand scale as well as the landscape scale. The monitoring methodology we're using here is point count surveys. Real simply, that means we go out to a point on the landscape and record all the birds that we hear or see within 5 minutes. We record their distance to the nearest meter, as well as what type of vocalization allowed us to detect them. In any given morning, a surveyor would do that at maybe 10 to 12 points across the landscape. So 10 to 12 5-minute surveys per morning. We do that during the breeding season. Point counts are only effective during the breeding season when birds are vocalizing to maintain their territories. And so we do that from late May to early July here. And then we're also collecting really coarse metrics of structure and composition, vegetation surveys that we do alongside our bird surveys. But we are also working closely with the Northern Blue CFLRP monitoring team. They were really instrumental to our study design in April. And so we have our site-specific plots co-located where the vegetation team is doing more in-depth vegetation monitoring. We'll be able to make some great inferences across the bird and vegetation monitoring at the stand scale. So we're monitoring at the stand scale. This monitoring right now is limited to the moist forests, and largely because it's time and funding limited. And Jamie's going to talk a little bit more in the field tomorrow about why we picked moist forests for this first year. But we went out and found about 14 treatment stands, and then we found matching control sites. So given that have 30% of our birds experiencing dramatic declines, it's incredibly important to have a spatial control because there's so much going on with our bird populations that if we just measure birds before and after, there's all these confounding factors. So we have a matched control site, and that control site can either be the same as the degraded condition, or it can be the desired condition. It doesn't really matter as long as the control site isn't going to change during your temporal monitoring. So we go in before, in this example, we have a before site that's degraded and a control site that's desired. And then post restoration, our restoration site is desired and our control site hasn't changed. These are visited twice per year. And we completed this in 2022 for those 14 sites. We do 2 visits per year because, again, there's a lot of differences in song rate even within the breeding season. And then we're also doing landscape scale monitoring because we are expecting both of those ideas to be really relevant to measuring response of your work as well as informing future work. So for our landscape scale monitoring, bear with me in this graphic, we're doing some We're using a distribution modeling approach. And so this is some work that is based off of one of our graduate students that applied this in 2019 in the Klamath-Siskiyou bioregion in Southern Oregon. It is published and well accepted. And so we're really excited because we are able to develop distribution models of bird occurrence against Landsat data. So if you think about most bird distribution models, bird distributions were typically modeled against vegetation, and that vegetation was modeled against Landsat. And so we're like, let's get rid of all that middle noise, and we can actually model our birds directly against the Landsat data, which is freely available historically and into the future. And so Landsat data has 7 spectral bands, and there's 4 of those that we found to be most closely associated with bird distributions. And we'll model all 7 again for this region, but end up using the ones that are telling the biggest part of that story. So we look at bird occurrence against, or bird abundance against Landsat. That's what's happening here. And then we develop this bird distribution model. So there in letter D, we have a bird distribution for lazuli bunting. So that's showing where abundance is highest on any given landscape. And then if we want to, we can stack these species distribution models for multiple species to develop a metric of, say, restored, resilient, open forest. So we would pick our focal species and our at-risk species that are the ones associated with that desired condition. We'd stack them on top of each other and combine those models. And so we're going to do a big blitz in 2023. This is going to keep Tom really busy next spring, visiting 56 routes, and each of those routes will have the 10 to 12 points. Because we're trying to cover a large amount of the landscape, we're going to limit it to a single visit to garner 550 to 600 points, which is a good amount to develop a distribution model across the entire northern blue sea flurp area. We're also doing some ongoing outreach to the Ochiko and Malheur National Forests, hoping to expand this to those areas as well. So this is going to be great once we develop them, because we can look right away at differences in space. So we can look at differences in bird distribution between our prioritized treatment areas and areas with desired conditions. We can look at those trade-offs at that landscape scale. And in that way, we're not just thinking about trade-offs at the site scale, because we're going to talk a little bit in the field tomorrow about how much of the landscape we're treating. And when we talk about how much of the landscape we're treating, that's when those trade-offs become a whole different conversation. We might have trade-offs at the site that are really acceptable in the context of trade-offs across the landscape. And then over time, what we're really excited about is creating this baseline data set that then we can use to measure the effects of the northern blue sea flurp, as well as any other natural disturbance that happens across that same time period. So if we have wildfires, or if there's extensive work on private lands, essentially we can measure the change in bird distribution over time. And so we can do this as a chronosequence, either backdating it. We can actually look at what the landscape has now compared to 10 years ago, but more importantly and relevant to your guys' work, look at what's happening 10 years from now. After we collect that pre-restoration data, understanding that there's already work happening on the ground, but that's kind of the pre-restoration blitz, having that implementation on the ground and going back out and doing post-restoration monitoring specifically at that site scale, not at the landscape scale. Already. Oh, yes. Okay, so how are we doing on time?
11:30, so we have about 20 minutes.
Jamie, do you want me to go through this like 5 to 7 minutes of science heavy stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I think this is going to increase excitement and not cause a complete glaze over, but it could go the other way. But I've been talking about this concept, right, of distribution models and chronosequence. And it all, it all sounds fine, right? But it's a little bit like, what's that gonna look like? So I'm really excited. We did a proof of concept about 12 months ago. And what we did is we applied this concept of the distribution models to compare an already published data set that used point count data. So this is the Quartz wildfire in my backyard in Southern Oregon. And we had a 10-year data set. We were lucky to have this happenstance have data prior to the fire. We were able to collect data for 10 years after, and we looked at changes in bird abundance based upon fire severity. High severity, moderate severity, and low severity. We did community composition analysis, and what we showed is that, in short, and I won't go into how you can tell that this happened, we didn't see much difference between our unburned sites before and after. That's what you'd expect. That's our control. We also didn't see we saw statistically meaningful difference in the burned, but the pattern wasn't real clear. And when we started separating it out by burn severity, we could see a clear pattern in that our high severity had a large difference before and after. Moderate severity also had a difference, and low severity, as you might expect, didn't show a difference. So while we saw a bit of statistical significance in burned, the pattern became more clear when we looked at severity, but our sample size dropped dramatically. And so we actually lost some of our statistical significance in the pattern that appears to be the most clear. So that paper was published in 2015. And what we wanted to do was see if we could replicate the results using our distribution models, and if we could actually increase the story where we had the lowest sample size, because now we have essentially endless data points. And so we used our distribution models to pull data points before and after the burn. And what you can see here is really strong results in high severity. Just like every single arrow is. Yeah, I'm just gonna gloss over. This is an ordination. I can tell you all about it if you want. But the take home is that these arrows are all moving in the same direction. Before and after, very different from the distribution models. This is essentially showing that we got the exact same result. No, not the exact same. We got an equally meaningful, statistically significant result from the distribution models as from serving those birds on the ground. So, and then we also saw a change in moderate and in low severity. You're actually seeing a bit more of a pattern there than we saw with our point count data. But because those arrows are going in all those different directions, that would suggest, and there's a p-value behind it, that it's not significant. We were even surprised ourselves that this worked. So, and then we applied it in a management scenario really similar to here. This is the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project outside of Ashland, where we've been doing a lot of forest restoration over the last decade. And so this is how it'll be applied in this region as well. And so here we have our control site, arrows going in every direction, nothing happening. And then what we found here, similar to the differences in fire severity, differences in density management versus surface and ladder. Essentially, density management is what we refer to as commercial, more larger trees removed. We're actually recategorizing this, but you would expect to see a stronger relationship in commercial. There's simply more work happening on the ground than in surface and ladders, where you're still seeing a pattern, but more of those arrows kind of some points not changing at all. Okay, I think that is exciting, right? Okay, that's the science. I'm now done with little arrow points. So through that, then we can have our collective learning. So all of this is only useful if we use it in our collaboratives, if we use it in our institutional knowledge. Everything we do at KBO, we try to publish, but equally importantly, we try to get it out through a lot of different mechanisms. So that Avian Knowledge Northwest is one way we do it. And then just the collective learning, as you guys know, a lot of the real work happens when we're out in the field together. And so really excited to be joining you guys on our first field trip tomorrow and to be talking with you about this platform of science for a long time to come. I do again want to acknowledge that the Northern Blue CFLRP monitoring team has been instrumental in helping us ensure that we're setting this up in a way to be successful. Brief acknowledgement of some of our partners at the joint ventures, again, National Audubon, a handful of other organizations. And I'll just close by saying I'm incredibly excited about this work because I think we're really at a moment of, there's this real restoration need. And then there's this amazing increase in pace and scale happening at the same time. And so we're able to work with you guys here at the Northern Blue CFLRP. We're also working with the Rogue Forest Partners and the Rogue Siskiyou National Forest CFLRP and applying really this concept across this entire region. And so I'm really hoping 10 years from now, birds can be another measure that tells the story of how effective this forest work was to achieve our desired conditions, and also, kind of provides that leverage and that social license to keep the momentum for this type of work. So.
Here, I'll bring back the Zoom photos. So if there's questions, I can see that.
So cool.
Questions from collaborative members? Yeah, all right.
I think this is mostly to Jamie, but well, there's two Jamies.
It's been so confusing, there are two games.
So you've been doing this work on with other board collaboratives or with other people, right? Like the Rogue Siskiyou.
The Rogue Siskiyou CFLRP's brand new.
Oh, okay.
But Rogue Forest Partners, which works in that same region, Rogue Siskiyou National Forest is part of that partnership, part of the Ocean Forest Resiliency. So if you take the word CFLRP out, yes.
Okay, I'm wondering, and that's to the Forest Service, Jamie, if this work has resulted in adaptive management. Like, has there been a change in what the Forest Service is going to do based off of the data that you collected and synthesized?
We have some really tangible examples of adaptive management that were like immediately impactful. A lot of those were based upon the stand scale monitoring and partially around skips and gaps in some types of ecosystems. The one that comes to mind is in an open ecosystem where we were measuring the skips of chaparral hatch size. And so we were able to go in and measure that our birds that were associated with chaparral were not using the small skips. They were able to go in really rapidly because we're part of the collaborative or part of the partnership, right? That's how science really gets to the table really quickly. And so in this example, we were able to say, well, why are we leaving skips? What were the reasons for leaving skips? And then part of that reason is to create habitat for chaparral associated birds. These skips aren't big enough. And so they started leaving much more larger skips. And then we think if there's an example with the distribution modeling is a lot more complex. And so the adaptive management piece of that is really, we're trying to think about like percent of the landscape that we're going to treat. And so we've got in that example down, Rogue Forest Partners has a strategy. The goal was to treat 38% of the landscape in order to reach your forest resilience goals. And so that's where we can start to look at some of those trade-offs and treatment prescriptions, but that I can't say is done yet, but I think that we're on a trajectory to using that at the landscape scale.
I had a question, Jamie. I think we had talked about this when we were initially discussing stuff, but it seemed like you usually just have one person going out and doing the point counts. Like, would you say this monitoring is relatively cost effective compared to other monitoring, that's an advantage to this.
You know, it's so funny because everybody says it's cost effective.
I mean, I guess what is cost effective,
I know.
but.
I see our costs like everyone else's are skyrocketing and I've stopped trying to sell it as cost effective because I no longer really know what cost effective is.
Yeah.
And also because our model is that we want to do that whole roadmap. We don't just want to survey birds, because that's how we can be effective. That's how we can achieve adaptive management. And that makes it slightly less cost effective. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But I
Jamie,
think-
what do you think?
Well, I think one thing that is cost effective is going to be the distribution models.
Oh, yeah.
Because we will be able to update them over time with the Landsat data, which won't cost us. Because after this CFLRP money dries up, we won't have people over here doing point counts, but at least now we have the baseline data to feed into the models so that we can have those to use as tools like in our effects analyses in the future. And
Yeah.
helping inform the management, the prioritization of treatments.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we're able to get like the OCHCO and now here involved, the cost effectiveness just increases in developing the models, because the main cost is that blitz of data and then the development. And so the more forests that are involved, the more cost effective it becomes.
I would like to talk to you about helping Dan get the chicken out here.
Great, thank you.
So I have a question on the monitoring. Is your monitoring data well accepted? So when you bring it back to the collaboratives, you feel really strongly about that you're giving good information.
Absolutely.
You don't get pushback from any particular groups of dogs.
You know, we don't, because Climate Bird Observatory's platform is not advocacy. And so we have always rooted our work in science. One of our earliest successes was working on a really contentious project in the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument. And so when the monument was declared, it was declared for the benefit of objects of biological interest. Right? How do we all interpret that? And so, of course, you have a lot of diverse parties that can't get on the same page about how we're going to manage for our objects of biological interest. And one of the big pushes was going to likely be a push to get the cows removed from the monument, the public grazing pieces. And so that was very contentious. And, you know, KBO came to the table and we said, what if we do some science? Do we think that birds are an object of biological interest? Yeah, everybody did. I think there was even an actual language. And so we were able to get funding for our work from the environmental group, get funding from the BLM, getting funding for our work from multiple, get everybody to buy in. So that always is a goal. And we worked hard on that here too, to get some various pieces of small money from a lot of different groups, meaning they have buy-in to that science before we go out there. And then we're able to, you know, bring that to the table. And that was an amazing success story too, where the science really led the decision making that led to some buyouts of those grazing pieces that everybody was generally okay with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So anyone on Zoom have any questions? Don't want to forget about you guys up here.
I have a really specific question. Williamson sapsucker was uncommon. And I wondered if that is related to survey techniques and behavior, or if they're actually uncommon, because in our fifth plan, it says they're a responsibility species and that a large portion of the population for Eastern Oregon, BCR 10 is here. So
Yeah.
I'm always thinking about Williamson's.
That's a really good question. So point counts are definitely a better methodology for songbirds. And so our woodpeckers and our sapsuckers don't vocalize on as regular of an interval. And so within that 5-minute count, they can absolutely be missed. And so we might want to think more specifically about that suite of species and not them off in that table. They might have been underserved for sure. Thank you for that.
How do you work with, I saw you had a thing out there on eBird, how do you work with these different sort of crowdsourcing data sets? Like, you know, what if some of us went out and found Williamson sapsuckers in 3 or 4 places? How do you guys work with that stuff?
Yeah, we work with eBird, kind of in 2 different ways, and we have an eBird Northwest for the same reason we have an Avian Knowledge Northwest, a regional node of eBird. And we sometimes do intentional study design community science, where we have our local birders and community scientists go out and record birds in specific places. So we actually design community science projects that then contribute to eBird. That's a really thoughtful way to do it. And then we also use, eBird is producing an amazing body of science right now. And so, you know, any local data that's contributed to eBird is scaling up to range maps and movement maps and like amazing science that is being pulled from those eBird data sets. Once in a while, we use the eBird data in our analyses as well, and could certainly think about that. We wanted to think about like gaps in the survey protocol around something like stats.
We don't have a ton of eBird data for Northeast Oregon, so we only have a handful of birders.
Yeah. I was gonna say, we're probably not rich in birders. But you never know.
I just want to provide a bit of context from the Northern Blues restoration, you know, the CFLRP group. First of all, amazing presentation. That was super cool. I felt like I was back in school for a minute. So. Yeah, that helped. But no, so Jamie was, you know, she presented to a group of folks that we got a CFLRP pot of money to do restoration work. And it's a hard sell to come into that group and be like, we want to take the maximum amount of monitoring funds to do monitoring into a group of people that are like, we are doers and we're going to go out and get a bunch of stuff done. And that presentation, I mean, I was blown away when it happened. And we were just like, you know, there was a motion that funded as presented, and we were just like, yep, we should totally do that. So very well put together, you know, thought process and presentation to the group, and the peer group is super impressed. And I hope that we can turn this into adaptive management in real time. I have a lot of questions specific, but I'm not going to ask them now. I'll wait till tomorrow. I don't know much, but I have a lot of yeah, I'm a silviculturist. That's my background. So
Yeah,
changing prescriptions based on this type of work is what I'm all about. So
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I look forward to working on that.
cool. Thank you.
And we have all day tomorrow to dig into it.
Yeah, and I believe that Chelsea, who was on the monitoring team last year, she works with Lucas Split, is gonna be on the field tour, so okay, just to help us and answer any questions about that and stuff.
Yeah, we were hoping some folks might be able to speak to the silviculture side tomorrow a little.
Yeah,
So I'll speak to the board.
yeah, that would be great.
Nice.
Yeah, and then I guess before there's any other questions, but my plan was we'll take this meeting recording and the slide deck, and I'm gonna send it out to the collaborative and really encourage folks who are not here for this meeting, but will be on the field tour to take a look at this, just because it provides a lot of context, and then I think that'll make for kind of some really robust conversations tomorrow too, if folks have more of that background information that we're not here today. But yeah, we have another minute or so. Folks have any other questions or?
I would just say, I think you're exactly right on with the monitoring. I think that's, you know, having independent monitoring is going to be incredibly important in terms of adaptive management, because it's so easy for people to look at one incident or one project versus showing that, you know, showing big changes in how you're adapting is important. So.
Yes. I did have a question about the distribution model and the Landsat data. How sensitive are are those data to be picking up scattered or smaller type treatments? For that, I'm kind of curious what what the granularity of that might be.
Yeah, so. When we do the modeling, we use several radius around the point. And so the point incorporates, and these aren't the exact ones, I didn't do the modeling, but for example, the point would incorporate the Landsat spectral data around 100 meters, around 1,000 meters, and maybe around 2,000 meters. And so it is considering both what's happening at the site and the landscape, and birds care about both. And so I would say the question is an important one. And I was relatively surprised that we were able to see that response in these stand scale prescription units in the Ashland Forest Resiliency. We did that cautiously as a proof of concept, but it does appear that we're able to detect change even within that site specific scale.
Forester by trade, I had to work to keep up with some, but it's pretty cool presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think we'll wrap up, and if folks have other questions, I'm happy to direct them towards Jamie, but I encourage everyone to be on the field tour tomorrow, and we can just get really in depth with some of these conversations. Yeah, for those of you coming on the field tour, we'll be meeting at the LeGrand Ranger office at 8:30. We'll be leaving at 8:45 towards Lod Canyon. I have a few folks that are coming from the Baker side that are gonna be meeting us just at the Lod Canyon exit a little bit before 9. But yeah, and
They're coming from Baker. Is that
Yeah.
what you said?
Shannon was one of,
Oh, I just didn't know if you realize if you're coming from Baker, you have to come to LeGrand and get off the interstate and then get back on.
Oh, I can't do that?
Or you
Just follow the-
yeah, you don't have to come all the way to the ranger station, but you do have to like, just so you're aware,
Just a little
come
bit.
this side.
I have a vet appointment that I have to do.